My name is Father Greg Kulsher. I'm the Dean of the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences and also the co-director of the Boston College Forum on Racial Justice in America. On behalf of the forum and my co-director, Joy Moore, and the School of Social Work, I'm pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion this evening of the documentary film, White Noise, The Rise of the Racist Right. As many of you will recall, the Forum on Racial Justice was founded a year ago in the summer of 2020 with two key purposes. First, to provide a meeting place for listening, dialogue, and greater understanding about race and racism in the United States. And second, to serve as a catalyst for bridging differences regarding race in America, promoting reconciliation, and encouraging fresh perspectives. Joy and I are looking forward to working with everybody on campus to build a national platform to engage in this important work. And we think tonight's panel discussion is an important contribution to that. This documentary, which explores the rise of white nationalism, is just the kind of work and the kind of issue I think that should be at the heart of discussion with the forum as we seek to help promote clear thinking about these kinds of important issues dealing with race in the United States and around the world. So thank you for joining us this evening. I'll now turn things over to Associate Professor Sam Bradley from the School of Social Work, and I hope you enjoy a vigorous and enlightening discussion this evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Father Kulsher. On behalf of the School of Social Work and our Dean, Gautam Yadama, as well as the Forum for Racial Justice in America, I welcome our audience members tonight. Tonight's subject is a difficult one, highlighted in the film White Noise, a documentary that explores white nationalism in America and the rise of the alt-right. As we engage in this difficult subject, I encourage audience members to do whatever they need to do to practice self-care and to support their own well-being. Also, I would like to acknowledge with respect that Boston College occupies the ancestral homelands of those American Indian tribes that have inhabited this land for centuries, including the Massachusetts people and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. We pay our respects to elders both past and present, and we name the genocide, displacement, and continued injustices carried out in the name of progress. With humility, we recognize and respect all Indigenous peoples, their histories and ties to the land. Boston College School of Social Work encourages you all to learn more and support decolonization efforts, such as land reclamation and native language education efforts. Indigenous rights are connected to all human rights. To start, we'd like to welcome Daniel Lombroso. Daniel is the director, co-producer, and cinematographer of the film White Noise. He is a filmmaker whose short documentaries have explored Russian espionage, the Israeli settlement movement, far-right Christian media, and more. He has reported across the US as well as in Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. Lombroso graduated from McGill University with a degree in political science and lives in New York City. White Noise is his feature film debut. I'd like to hand it over to Daniel and say that we welcome you tonight. And, I like to say that the film is terrific and terrifying all at the same time.
Well, thank you guys. It's wonderful to be here, and I look forward to answering questions and talking about the film. I guess I could just say briefly, this was a 4-year endeavor starting when I was a little baby reporter at The Atlantic out of college. At the time, the alt-right was not something that was really taken seriously. It was something that I knew as a young person leaving college campuses only a year or two before. And it was obvious to me that all of these young people who looked like me and sounded like me were coalescing behind then candidate Trump. Remember, he was one of 16 candidates at the time. And there was a tremendous amount of energy for him on the streets, but especially online on, many of you remember this on, forums like Reddit and 4chan and things like that. And it was clearly very racist and very anti-Semitic, but it wasn't being taken seriously. So I started covering it with, short articles and short documentaries. And one of them was catching a room full of people breaking onto Nazi salutes. Some of you might remember that from 2016. And that was when my coverage started. I caught that video. It was shocking to me and shocking to everyone at The Atlantic. We put it online and it went viral, and I think made a very important point that the alt-right wasn't just some conservative movement like, Bush era conservatism talking about tax cuts. It was really a white nationalist movement. From there, the project just kind of organically became a feature. I went to Russia and France and Belgium and Canada and all around the US, and I just saw, this burgeoning movement behind Trump, but many other foreign leaders as well in Europe. And eventually that led me to the three protagonists in the film: Richard Spencer, Mike Cernovich, and Lauren Southern, who I saw having, a huge amount of influence online. Unfortunately, they were reaching hundreds of thousands or millions of people and really shaping so many's perspective on the world and on questions of race relations. So it became my focus to document them and to expose them. And I think, I'm sure we'll talk about all these things across the panel, but I think the goal really became two things making the film. One is to just show, the naked racism that still shapes so much of our society, that it's really just out in the open in ways people don't want to see, from Nazi salutes in DC, but, Mike Cernovich has a big event in New York City. Lauren Southern is exploiting migrants in Paris. She screens her film at the European Parliament. And then the other kind of, goal of the film was to show actually how empty this stuff makes you, that towards the second half of the film, you see that even though they feel, they've had a lot of success, this ideology doesn't make you happy. It's almost like a drug. It fixes you temporarily. And many of the people I know and have followed are now struggling with the same issues that they had 4 or 5 years ago. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of contradictions and hypocrisies at the heart of this ideology. White Noise tries to expose that. And I'm so excited to be talking about it with everyone here.
Thank you, Daniel. I'd like to also welcome Dr. Usher Nara, who is a professor in the Department of Counseling, Developmental and Educational Psychology at the Boston College Lynch School of Education and Human Development. She is also an independent practice in Cambridge as a psychologist. Her scholarship focuses on immigration, race, gender, interpersonal and collective trauma, as well as culturally informed psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So welcome, Usha.
Thank you so much, Sam. I really appreciate it. And Daniel, I agree with Sam that I found it so powerful. The film, as well as terrifying and really unnerving, but it's so important, particularly because, as you said, these things are sort of usually pocketed off. And I would say even in our geographical location, living in Boston, in Massachusetts, there's a way in which we disavow some of these realities as though they belong to fringe movements and not mainstream America. And in fact, what your film does is really help us ground ourselves in reality rather than participate in a sort of a dissociative process that I think is so much a part of what's happened around race and racism in our country, and I would say globally as well. So I just have a few comments that I thought I would add as I watched the film, and I watched it a couple of times and tried to really mull over this. So I'll just share a couple of my thoughts from based on what I've done in my research and my practice as well. So one of the things that was so striking is how young this movement is. I mean, you talked, Daniel, about being in college and being exposed to some of this. And I was just so struck by how young the movement is and how dystopian and hopeless it is. Even though it's invigorating, there's this, as you said, towards the end, you see this kind of emptiness and loss of hope and loss of trust in humanity. And it was deeply hopeless and negative, and I think as I watched it, I thought, wow, generationally speaking, what is going on here? That I remember being in college and not having that sense of hopelessness, and I'm a person of color, I'm a woman of color. I didn't feel that way. And why was that? And so your film really kind of made me think about what is going on intergenerationally here, that these young people in the film feel so much dystopia. I also found it striking to see some racial minorities be a part of the movement, that this was not this kind of caricature of what a white nationalist looks like or acts like or talks like. This was really, it blurred boundaries around race and gender and sexuality, sexual orientation, that it wasn't sort of like this group believes this, set of social justice values and this group doesn't. It really sort of made the issues far more complex, I would say, which I thought was incredibly rich in your film. And I also found the language, the use of racist, misogynistic language so profound in the film. And this idea of feminism as being toxic, this idea, and contrasting it with what I think many of us in liberal academia, talk about in terms of toxic masculinity. It was really interesting to see this other perspective on feminism itself being toxic. So it was just these juxtapositions of these completely opposing theoretical ideologies, that was really, really interesting and powerful. I also, going back to a comment I made earlier about dissociation, I really felt that these layers of dissociation pervading the way that people thought and sort of justified their way of viewing the world and viewing others as well as themselves. And so in psychology and in the trauma literature and the psychoanalytic literature, we think a great deal about how dissociation operates intrapsychically, how it operates interpersonally, as well as collectively. And so I just want to highlight a couple of examples of this. Like, for example, when there's this disavowal of Nazi ideology and behavior, the question, like, how does this make me a Nazi? How am I a Nazi? When the interviewer is asking, aren't you sort of aligned with Nazi ideology? Another example that came up for me was around rape culture and how, rape doesn't happen here. We don't have a rape culture here. That's out there in Africa. And, that belongs somewhere else. This kind of disavowed, dissociated process. There was this other type of dissociation, and this had to do with this idea that white people created the US. It's a dissociation, it's a disavowal of actual history as well. That there was somehow this group of people who made America, and that's who it belongs to. So, again, very different types of dissociation. Another form was when I saw the partners, Lauren Southern's partner, Mike's partner. There are these, the partners were not white. And so how does all of this get reconciled, both intrapsychically, but also collectively in their message to other people about white nationalism? The other thing that stood out to me was the lack of recognition of why people flee their countries of origin, that maybe colonization and racism played a role throughout the course of centuries that eventually led to people actually having to flee their country. So that the narrative is sort of twisted, like they are trying to come and get what we have. They are the dangerous ones, rather than really thinking about, the human aspect of people who are fleeing and the human aspects of migration. And so really kind of twisting it. And in psychoanalysis, there's a theoretical understanding of the concept of dependency. And dependency is a really interesting theme to me in this film, because the narrative is they need us, we don't need them. And so, post-colonial scholars and within psychoanalysis have really argued this point around dependency, that colonization required whites to see others as dependent on them. And so here we see a replay of this. And so they created this idea of the inferior race or the inferior people and an inferiority complex, like taking from Alfred Adler's work and extending that. So I found that to be really interesting theme here too, that, if we just see them as dependent on us and we don't need them, then they are not human, they are less human, and they don't deserve to be American, so I found those dynamics to be very powerful as well. So with that, I will stop for now, and I'd love to hear others.
Thank you, Usher. It's always good to get the psychological analysis for something like this. Our next panelist is Emily Kaufman. And Emily is an investigative researcher with the Center on Extremism. She has a background in detecting extremist online speech through coding schemes. And Emily covers the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, Ecofascists, and some Accelerationist groups. She has assisted with law enforcement investigations and alerts, presented with Jewish congregations, at law enforcement advisory committee meetings, and law enforcement webinars, and of course, the Glass Leadership Institute sessions with the Anti-Defamation League. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Professor Nara and Daniel for your comments here. And I, of course, as everyone else has been really moved by the documentary, but also concerned about a lot of what we saw in the documentary, and unfortunately how it persists in the current day. And so now looking back at this footage, I feel it's really it's foreshadowed a lot of what we've seen as this movement has continued to develop. One thing that really struck me was how each individual featured really tried to remove themselves from responsibility for the actions that they took, and that they didn't see the fact that their rhetoric could be aligned with the action of someone else, someone who had taken, at Charlottesville with the tragic death of Heather Heyer and individuals like that. They couldn't connect that their rhetoric might be related to real world outcomes. And I wanted to talk for a minute just about how rhetoric is really impactful, and how this movement can drive people to action. So looking to the beginning of this year, of course, we all remember the insurrection on January 6th. And what we found at the Center on Extremism, we have a database of 512 individuals who were arrested related to the insurrection. This number is, of course, growing every day as more arrests are made. But of those individuals, 23% of those were members of known extremist groups, right? So members of the Proud Boys, or Oath Keepers, or other anti-government extremists, QAnon adherents, etc. So that was 23% of those folks. But then there were 77% of people who were not, card-carrying extremists, right? So these people were motivated by something else. They weren't being fed by extremist ideology necessarily, but the climate of escalating rhetoric in this country really made it seem like it was incumbent upon them to act in order to defend their country, defend from a stolen election, right? This big lie that was created. So in this way, we can see directly that this kind of rhetoric and these information ecosystems in which people find themselves in, where they're being fed a certain kind of narrative, can be really, really powerful. And in addition, I wanted to mention, to me, one of the most painful and hard to watch moments of the film is when we see Lauren Southern going to bring migrants that she sees cookies, right? And like trying to, so this really, really painful and hard to watch to see her exploiting people in this way. And again, she does seem kind of divorced from the reality of what this means. But we see, and we've unfortunately seen mainstreamed this language of invasion, and these people are coming and taking over, and these theories of the great replacement, right? That this rising tide of color is coming to take over the United States. Depending on what conspiratorial angle you're coming at this, you might think that Jews are the ones who are enabling these multicultural policies, etc. But all of these actions have consequences, and we now see mainstream politicians, in some cases, right? I can think of cases with representatives in Arizona, for example, talking about invasions and immigrants coming across the border, and this is really, really damaging, and this language is very dangerous. And just this past month, right, we're seeing now with Afghan refugees returning to the U.S., we're seeing this kind of rhetoric come out again, right? And so not in some cases, right, folks coming to the U.S. from Afghanistan at this point are refugees, but they're also immigrants who've been granted special immigrant visas because of what they've done for our country. But we've seen white supremacists again talk about this invasion, and so this isn't going away, I guess, unfortunately, is the point that I'm here to make, which I think the film shows how this movement really grew and escalated. And I think, unfortunately, we are still really right in the depths of what the alt-right has kind of brought forth in a lot of ways into the US. So I think the film is especially poignant when you're able to kind of be where we are now, and looking back and seeing, unfortunately, how a lot of these things kind of predicted some outcomes that we're seeing right now. So yeah, with that, I'll turn it back over, and looking forward to discussing further.
Thanks a lot, Emily. I really appreciate that. So we are actively taking questions from the audience. And so when you have them, please feel free to place those into the chat. Our very first question comes tonight, says, I was struck by how different their actual lives were from their message, and that their racism wasn't reflected in their realities. While I recognize their hypocrisy, I also know that it's a view of some people in America that we need to recognize. Simply dismissing it as madness would be short-sighted. So Daniel, I would open it up for a reflection on that. So I guess the boils down to really, how do we really, I think, engage in conversation when folks are dismissing the impact of this rise of white nationalism that we're seeing?
I think, as both speakers have said so articulately, I mean, this is just changing the paradigm of politics in the US and abroad. I mean, in my idea, I mean, basically race is now the fault line in American politics, and demographic change is what we're ultimately talking about. I mean, by 2045, the US will be a minority non-white, and there are many ways to define that. And, it's a little bit complicated about where mixed race will fall and people's self-identities might change. But either way, the white population in the US is declining at a fast rate, in Europe at a slower rate, but to some extent as well. And that's provoking, whether, certainly not deserved, but whether as a result of that or not, terrorism all around the world, as Emily was saying. I mean, we've seen, an attack targeting a mosque in New Zealand, and a synagogue in Pittsburgh, in El Paso, in an effort to target Mexicans. And all of those, shooters left manifestos, and all of those manifestos talked about white replacement, talked about migrant invasions, the things that we've talked about so far. So, I mean, I really think, this coming multicultural America is a beautiful thing. It's a chance to finally achieve, the spirit of the founding fathers, that this is a multiracial democracy and has the chance to be really the first ever in the world. But it also has the chance to be this different thing, which is a country with a really strong white reactionary movement that refuses to give rights and power to non-white people, whether it's through redlining or redistricting or terrorism. And we've seen it in all different forms. To some of the earlier points, which I think is part of this question, is how do they reconcile things? And Professor Molyneaux Nara said this so well. They really don't. And it was baffling to me, and it is what made the film so interesting to make. You wouldn't know by my last name, but I'm Jewish. Both my grandmothers are Holocaust survivors. My dad is from Israel. Like, I grew up in a pretty conservative Jewish home. And I would be honest with them about that. And two of the three characters, Cernovich is somewhat exempt, really are, not fond of Jews. And for some reason, they grew to like me. They grew to open up to me, and they made an exception for me. And I think that's sort of the key word, is that people are willing to make exceptions for those that they like. And they did it for me making the film, and they also do it for their partners. I mean, Cernovich is with a Persian woman. She grew up in a secular Muslim family. I met her parents, who were born in Iran. That was their, they speak Farsi at home. His kids are biracial and speak Farsi at home. Lauren Southern ended up with an Asian Australian man. We don't say his race at the end of the film, just that it's a non-white partner, but I wrote an adjacent piece in The Atlantic where we talk about a little bit more about his background and how they ended up together. And she also doesn't see the contradiction, that she's a crusader for whiteness, and yet she had a non-white kid out of wedlock. So I think what it comes down to is that these people have come to feel intoxicated by their fame, by their power, and like many powerful people, that leads to corruption, and they're willing to, create carve-outs and exemptions for things that they like. And even Nazi leaders had relationships with Jews. It's a theme throughout history, that even the most racist, like Thomas Jefferson, of course, had kids with his slaves. So this is something we see again and again, and something that I experienced frequently. And then just one last point, Professor Molyneaux Nara mentioned the presence of racial minorities, and I've talked about them. And it is another kind of confounding thing that I think adds some complexity. When Richard Spencer says, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory," you have to look very closely, but there's a Sikh man throwing a Nazi salute. And there's a whole Reddit forum trying to figure out why he was doing that. In the opening scene is this guy, Ali Akbar, who's half black, half Arab, and he was one of the main organizers of January 6th. And you see that a lot. There's a very strong presence of gay men in the alt-right. And I haven't really cracked the code either, but again, there's something about the bigness of the ideology, the feeling that you're part of something larger that can attract people. But in the end, it is empty. It's filled with contradictions, and all of them maybe don't regret their actions, but certainly regret becoming part of something that never really cared about them, that didn't give them what they were ultimately looking for.
Thank you. Emily, did you want to add to that?
Sure, if I could just add, so this is something, so I cover the Proud Boys, and we see this a lot within their organization, and I think maybe it's certainly not, to be generalized to other groups, but something we see a lot with this group is the fact that they often tout the fact that they are a racially diverse group. They'll often say, well, we have a chapter in Israel, how can we be anti-Semitic? We have, Enrique Tarrio is a Cuban American, like how can we be a racist organization? But what happens is, their actions frequently belie these claims, right? So you can say that, all day, and you can optically, right, try to say this and make this a reality. But then you look at a Telegram channel called the Western Chauvinist, right, which is 50,000 plus now subscribers strong, that is run by third and fourth degree Proud Boys, so Proud Boys who have gone through significant rounds of initiation and good standing, that is celebrating Hitler's birthday, that is, like an incredibly white supremacist in nature. So, you can, unfortunately, it's like these things can kind of exist together, and they often use the fact that they are, diverse in order to justify their actions. So it's like this line that they try to walk, but it's really, I always try to like, what is this group actually doing? What are their actions? If you are tearing down a Black Lives Matter banner outside of a historically Black church in DC, as they did on December 12th during the Million MAGA March, in DC, like that is a profoundly racist act, right? So it's, they try to divorce their kind of group demographics from the reality of the racist actions that the group takes, but those things.
And I have a question that is asked for Dr. Nara, but I'll actually open this up to the entire panel. And it says, from a psychological perspective, how do you interact with a person who participates in this disassociative thinking, which is essentially gaslighting when it's turned onto conversations? It's extremely frustrating for someone to not accept responsibility for their actions or views, let alone make you think that you're crazy for believing so. And I'm certain that there are many audience members out there thinking about that one uncle that they're going to talk to at Thanksgiving. So I'd love to hear from the panel.
I can start. It's a great question, and I'm going to try to relate it to the previous question somewhat, because I think there's a thread there that I'm picking up on, and that is that there's Ilani Kogan, who is actually an Israeli psychoanalyst. She's written about this idea of how liberal thought and international human rights recognize minority people's rights, but they feel they somehow dismiss that majority status people have identities and a culture and an ideology. And so what she's pointing out is that there's this invisibility of whiteness, even though, because whiteness sort of becomes a standard or a norm that everything else and everyone else is sort of, measured against or set against. And so there's this assumption that that's just like being white is the normal thing and everything else is not the normal thing, from a psychological perspective, like being outside the standard in that sense. So I think that when we don't recognize that whiteness is actually a thing, that there's something deeper about that. I don't think we've analyzed whiteness enough, actually, on a global scale. I think we've analyzed colonization and racism and cultural identity as it relates to people of color and BIPOC folks far more than we have white people. I would also say that's true for white men in particular. There's something about, not understanding the fact that the majority of suicides committed in this country are by white men between ages 18 and 35. And so there's a lot that we're actually not understanding. So when we're met with someone who has an ideology like this that is so different from ours, like, well, how do we manage that? I think one thing I try to do, and it's not easy because I don't agree with that ideology, obviously, but one thing I try to do is remember that this is a human being that has a particular experience that is probably largely invisible to me, even though it's very dominant and very powerful from a systemic, lens. But interpersonally, I don't know what's going on for them, And there's a lot more that I think we need to look at beyond sort of the categories of race.
I guess the part that I could add is from the filmmaking perspective was to expose without enabling, my goal was to draw them out, to make them feel comfortable around me, and to use my voice off camera when relevant. It wouldn't have furthered the agenda of the film for me to quibble with them at every single restaurant or every flight we were on together. I mean, I spent literally thousands of hours with the three subjects and everyone in their orbit. And, if I was combative every moment, it really wouldn't have furthered the film. And my goal was to help everyone here and everyone around, the US and the world understand just how strong this movement is and to understand what it believed. So I really picked my moments when I saw, really profound contradictions. One of them being is, Lauren slut shaming sexual assault survivors, then later in the film deals with sexual harassment and doesn't understand how it affects her. She doesn't regret anything, but she's also upset that the men in the movement are quite harsh to her. And there are many other contradictions. Cernovich is an alpha male, and yet he brags about taking money from his first wife. I mean, that being a funnier one. And, it goes on and on and on across the film. The fact that their rhetoric, to Emily said, leads in a pretty direct line to violence. So many of the things that these subjects have said, whether directly or indirectly, have ended up in the manifestos that I've mentioned in New Zealand and El Paso and Pittsburgh and elsewhere. So I tried to use my voice as something that would, help the audience. That was a necessary question that everyone in the audience was thinking or feeling. But, my goal was to draw people out. And, I admire psychology, and I've never worked in the field, but I mean, I was hoping to kind of almost like a relationship a therapist would have with a subject or with a client, to make them feel comfortable and to draw them out, because so much of the reporting, as important as it was kind of like BBC showdown style interviews, and that achieves something. It shows that Richard Spencer is an idiot and is, misguided, but it doesn't really draw out, the psychology underneath it. So that was always my goal, is, how could I get as deep into their minds as possible? How can I capture something that no one else has captured? And the way I did that was to kind of wait for my moments to push back.
Thank you. My next question is, in the past, we could have relied on our political institutions and the judicial system as a counter to such ugly extremism. How robust do you think these institutions are today as a countervailing force?
I mean, I guess I can answer from the cheery extremist research perspective that I'm bringing here. But something we are continually concerned with is when extremists are trying to get involved in politics, and we've actually seen movements, strategic movements. I talked about the Proud Boys before, but that's a strategy that they've been employing, to get involved at politics at very local levels, so that they can help to kind of infiltrate those systems. So people are seeking influence, and I think a lot of folks have seen the Trump presidency as emboldening, right? Like that we maybe there is a place for us in mainstream politics, and so a lot of these groups that we saw the insurrection, for example, have been trying to insert themselves more and more into political spaces, and whether or not that's actually running for office, like running for a particular local office, or whether that's just kind of inserting themselves into every kind of possible debate. I think we're seeing a lot more. So, you know, I keep just returning to the Proud Boys because that's my kind of subject matter expertise. But if you're looking at them, they traditionally came to provide security for GOP events, for example. But this past summer, any school board meeting they could show up to that was talking about debating critical race theory, or anti-mask and anti-vaccine protests, you know, continuing to show up and become part of this narrative that is becoming more of a mainstream narrative on the right. So I think there are a lot of attempts to become part of a more mainstream narrative and to also directly become involved in politics. But I guess that's not commenting on the institutions as they stand. That's just what the extremists are trying to do.
Yeah, I can't comment on the courts, for instance, but at a rhetorical level, which I think is overlapping with what Emily's saying, is, you know, these groups have created a space for the Republican Party, for Fox News to talk about racial issues in a way they didn't in the past. And I don't mean to exonerate like Iraq, you know, Bush era conservatism. Of course, there were dog whistles, and of course, there was the Willie Horton ad with Bush's father. But now it's so in the mainstream that we are just conditioned to hearing it. Tucker Carlson is, you know, the most watched show on cable news. You know, he talks openly about white replacement and migrant invasions and all of the buzzwords that I heard Richard Spencer talking about 5 or 6 years ago. Now we're on, you know, the most watched cable news show every night. Far-right parties are doing really well in the US, but especially in Europe. I think you can't separate. It is an international film by design. And, you know, we saw Salvini in Italy do really well 3 years ago. I think he's since declined a bit, but he'll be back. Le Pen has, you know, France has an election coming up, and Le Pen, you know, was one of 2 candidates last time. Of course, Viktor Orban is still in power in Hungary. And there's many, many others in Poland as well. You know, a lot of countries that we saw as moving in a more liberal direction, especially Eastern Europe, like Hungary, Poland, have actually only moved in the opposite direction. And American conservatives, it's shocking, who hated communism are now going to Eastern Europe to kiss the ring of people like Viktor Orban. I mean, it's a really weird turn of events. They admire someone like Vladimir Putin, who used to be in the KGB and is an authoritarian. He goes against all, you know, Republican principles of freedom and democracy. And yet many of them are, you know, proud of his authoritarian tendencies and his racist tendencies. So, you know, I really focused on the rhetorical level, and I think it's been a pretty clear change since 2015.
So one of the parts of the movement is the fear that there'll be no ability to build a society that does not have common values, such as those values that are Judeo-Christian in nature. These folks seem to have a perception that multiple ways of being can't coexist. How do you respond to this in terms of efforts to try to build multiple ideologies, values, orientations in a single culture or society?
Maybe I can start on that one. It's such a great question because, you know, what do you do with all of this is, you know, sort of the underlying question, I think, in this, in what's posed here. And I think what your film, Daniel, does is it brings us, it makes very explicit that we can't see Trump as an aberration. You know, it's that this is a part of our country, our society. This is where we are. And I think there's something about just not dismissing that, but really reckoning with it and recognizing it for what it is and inviting more information in rather than trying to, you know, get away. I think when Trump was elected, you know, and I'm guilty of this too, of just trying to be like, okay, let's just get through these next 4 years and then things should get better. And I don't think that way any longer, but, you know, and certainly the film, you know, affirms that none of us should be doing that. In fact, if anything, we should be reckoning with this. And when you have such disparate value systems or ideologies, there's either you can work through it and identify it, or you can sort of, you know, continue living in these separate worlds. and ultimately, crumble together. So there's a way in which I guess the film to me raised this challenge of like, how am I going to work through this, and how am I going to work through this with people in my life that I kind of have been avoiding, and what do I do with them at this juncture beyond, the election of last year, the 2020 election. So those are just a couple of very free associative thoughts. I'd love to hear from everyone else.
Yeah, the film, by design kind of dares you to stare into the void. It does not offer a solution, because there really isn't one solution. It would have felt wrong. It would have felt prescriptive in a way that this movie isn't. I mean, it's an observational film. It tries to capture a phenomenon, and I think it captures one that's really scary and hopefully is a wake-up call for viewers. The solutions are something I think about a lot, and there are not any obvious ones. I mean, one of them is having these sorts of conversations as much as you possibly can in professional settings and private settings. Another, and this sounds a bit high-minded, but kind of taking a page from the alt-right, they've done a very good job of constructing a group identity. When you meet, and you see this in the movie, when you meet the subjects, and especially people under them, it's almost like they're drunk, like they're intoxicated, like they've bought into this worldview so much that they feel found and liberated from their depression or anxiety or whatever it is that they're feeling. Obviously, they're finding a sense of purpose and community in the worst possible place, but it shows that it's possible to achieve that. And earlier in the lecture, Professor Molyneaux said, maybe there's a generational difference. Why are all these people attracted to this? As a younger person, I can say, like, many people my age feel lost, feel confused, struggle with mental health and depression. And, I think in the past, there were a lot of institutions that would help. There were higher rates of church membership, for instance, and people joined the army at much higher rates. And now there's a lot more social isolation. People spend a lot more time on their phones. I think all of those are, to sound like the boomer here, negative trends and are just leading to more social isolation. And I think it's on liberals or people who believe in multiculturalism to kind of mirror, I know it sounds controversial, but to mirror what the alt-right did and to try to create a story for people who believe in a multicultural America, that we have a chance to do something really special, to do something that no country's ever done, to share power across so many different ethnic groups. And I haven't really seen a politician kind of run on that, or AOC does to some extent and some others do. But I think we're in this unique historical moment where we may or may not become a multiracial democracy. And I think that's really important. And that's something that people could rally around.
Daniel, I'm hoping that perhaps you can discuss the ending to the film cinematically as a political statement, noting that we're still very much within this moment and this movement, and sort of how you see the ending of the film tying to even like January 6th and the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah, so there's sort of two endings. There's the hysterical one of Richard playing piano and waxing philosophically about the ethno-state. And that was, the film begins with character and ends with character, and it just felt right not to end on a montage, but to bring back to what the movie is at a more psychological level, which is these deeply narcissistic people who have no sense of, their place in the world, no sense of self-awareness. And Richard, of course, is the most bombastic of the three. But I think what they're probably getting at is that montage at the end where you see the violence around the world, you see the rhetoric changing on Fox News and the Republican Party. And I think the goal was to say, even though these three, loonies are on the decline to some extent, and they're more or less exactly where the film left them. Richard is living in his mom's basement, her mom's house, live streaming from her basement. Cernovich is selling supplements, and he stays relevant of the three the most, finding ways. And Lauren now lives in Australia with her partner and has really struggled to recover actually from this film and the article that I wrote. And I think the movie tries to say that even though these three have declined, the movement is now kind of in the bloodstream of American life. Their ideas have really changed the way we think and talk and are now in the DNA of the Republican Party, most importantly. So I think that's where we tried to leave it. And some people said, January 6th, aren't you so upset you finished your film before? I don't know that it would have made a difference. I could have seen it being a few shots in that montage, But I think the movie in some ways predicted, of course, not that specific an event, but an event like it, saying that this is a dangerous ideology. It's only, on the rise, and maybe not with these three, but among their followers and beyond. And it's something that we're going to grapple with for a long time. When January 6th happened, I wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe and talked about Richard Spencer's first speech. I mean, he said, to be white is to be a crusader, to be a conqueror. I mean, this is a fundamentally violent movement, and it's one that won't stop until, that won't stop. And, the more multicultural America becomes, probably the more they'll dig their heels in. So I'm not sure where this ends, but I think, like Emily said earlier, I think we're just in the middle of the story.
Thank you. So one of our audience members says, I'm still thinking about the film days after watching it. It is so powerful. I can't imagine what it must have been like working on the film for so many years, as Daniel did, or studying groups like the Proud Boys day in and day out, as Emily does. Social workers are encouraged to practice self-care, especially when dealing with these difficult topics. What advice might the panelists have for future social workers? How do they deal with the trauma of it all and practice self-care? This sounds like one of my students. I'll hand that over to the panelists.
Daniel, do you want to start? I can start too. So yeah, no, that's a great question, and one I think that comes up a lot. And the first thing to say is it is, I mean, difficult and challenging to kind of be. I mean, for me, it's in happening online spaces, right, where these groups are. I'm not like Daniel was, directly interacting with folks every day. But there is certainly a lot of really terrible places on the online space that myself and my teammates encounter on a daily basis. And I think there's a few things that enable you to continue with this work. The first is, the team of people that you're working with. I feel very fortunate to work with a really incredibly supportive team that I know if, I ever did want to step away for, for a day or for a few moments or what have you, that they would be incredibly supportive of that. And then the kind of second two parts, first, the kind of sad reality is you do become a bit desensitized to a lot of this, and I often forget when I'm talking to other people that this is shocking information, because I'll see something and I'm like, everyone's shocked, but oh yes, yeah, or I tend to be a smiley person, and so sometimes I'm saying something while smiling when I should not be, so that there's kind of that element, but also things move so quickly that there's honestly not a lot of time to dwell on individual things that happen, which is really sad, but it's kind of, we're always moving on to the next thing, whether it's the next threat, the next event, different groups and how they operate. So that's the kind of threefold answer for me, at least there.
I don't have a good answer to this one. Write a memoir one day, I guess. That's when I'll process it. It was, I mostly worked alone, what's called one-man band in filmmaking, and that was really because of budgetary constraints. The Atlantic is a prestigious magazine. Now I'm at the New Yorker, and these are places everyone admires, but there's actually not as much money flowing around as you would expect. There might be for a print reporter, but that's one person, spending a long time. But to make a film at this level, at the very least, it's someone like me, and that's why I'm the director, cinematographer, co-producer. And when you watch stuff on Netflix, it's a crew of 5 or 7 or 10, and obviously that would have given me a lot more protection. But it's something that we just could have never afforded. The film wouldn't have happened. I also think the film is all about access. It's all about meeting them. And there was something neutralizing about it just being me, them just knowing that it was me. And in a way, it was kind of Daniel's film. Daniel's here to visit, unless, the mainstream media or the left-wing media is back again. We created a personal relationship. I think what I could share is more how hard it was, maybe, if that would be helpful. But the biggest disconnect, what I struggled with most, was just sharing with people what I was experiencing and having them understand at all. Like, I was living in DC at the time in a group house, like on my crappy salary, first with 8 people, then with 3 people. I don't think I ever lived alone when I was making the movie. And I would come back from these trips in Russia or in Florida, and people were saying horrible things to me and anti-Semitic things, and I was getting hate mail and all this stuff. And I'd come back, and my roommates would be like, "Hey, Daniel, why didn't you take the trash out?" Or, "Hey, we're going to a party, can you come?" And like things that felt very petty to me, and I had to be just try to be polite and, be as present as I could. But of course, I was really struggling with everything I was witnessing. So I guess my not advice, but my thoughts for someone in social work is, yeah, like when someone is going through such a traumatic project, I guess giving them the space and the tools to know how to decompress. I really didn't know what to do. I told friends and family, I journaled once in a while, but I really sat on it. And now it really feels behind me. It's not something that bothers me. And one day maybe I'll write about it and I do events like this. But in the moment, in those 3 years, I really was not actually sure who to tell and what to tell them. Because you describe being at a white nationalist event in the middle of a field in Florida, no one knows what that means. So it was more that perspective.
Thank you. Alicia, we really love to hear from you too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm struggling with how to respond to that too, I think, because on one hand, to do this work, or particularly around traumatic stress, there's you really have to be immersed, you really have to be a witness, and you have to bear the pain that comes with knowing and listening and really engaging with what's happening. And yet at the same time, you need your own supports. You need distance as well. So I think for me, I've tried to kind of, talk about other things. For me, I need distance away from it so that I can come back a little bit more refueled and equipped to listen better and listen with more attunement and process, more clearly. But for me, a lot of it is sort of moving in and out of that space. And for each of us, it's a different thing what that requires. For me, it's spending time with my kids and spending time with friends, or doing something that is physical that kind of relieves that stress. But the thing I fear is that if I'm too distant from it, then I won't actually be able to witness. And for me, whether I'm thinking about that from a research perspective or a clinical practice perspective, it's really important that I be present. So it's a lot you carry sort of cumulatively.
Another audience member says, I appreciate Dr. Nara's insights about disassociation. I also wonder about general ignorance / lack of education among the individuals in the film. Do the panelists have any hope that public education, even beginning at the youngest ages, can disrupt white supremacy? This seems particularly important given the anti-critical race theory movement across many states that we see today.
I can start briefly. It's a tricky question. A lot of the people who appear in the film are highly educated. And I know that might sound surprising, but Richard Spencer completed half a PhD as a master's from the University of Chicago. Mike Cernovich had, passed the bar in LA and can practice law if he wants to. And Lauren Southern is certainly a smart person. She dropped out of college, but she's articulate. She's quick on her feet. That doesn't, being intelligent doesn't mean you can't be misguided. Many Nazi officials were highly educated. Of course, many slaveholders in history knew what they were doing was wrong, but at the time were seen as, the Enlightenment thinkers of the day. So I do think it's important to kind of take away the line between, to say that it's always a straight line between educational attainment and level of ignorance or racism. That being said, of course, it's always a good thing to teach about multiculturalism, the civil rights movement, the history of white supremacy in this country, the history of the Nazis in Europe, and genocides that have happened around the world, from Cambodia to Rwanda, and all the things that can happen when a dominant ethnic group goes after a minority ethnic community. But I do think one of the subtexts in White Noise is that this stuff is everywhere. It's in liberal enclaves like New York City and Southern California and Florida and all the different places that we visit, Paris and Belgium, across the film. So it's not so much educated versus uneducated. It's really helping people find purpose in their life that isn't tied to something as destructive as this.
Yes, I would just add there teaching, especially, younger folks these days to be critical consumers of information, because we live in, in an era where you can really exist in a silo, and it's really easy to be caught in these, kind of radicalization spirals, right? One YouTube video recommends the next, and if you're searching for, push to 9/11, the next film is going to be more conspiratorial. It's not going to kind of reroute you in that way. So there's also, I think there's a lot of responsibility that that technology companies bear to kind of work through how you're interacting with these mainstream platforms to see what ways that you can redirect. But I think it's also incredibly critical to have to learn about the history of the United States, if that's the context that we're looking at, to look at the white supremacist history of the United States, and the Anti-Defamation League, so not our center on extremism, but we have an education department that does anti-racist and anti-bias education trainings for students, called No Place for Hate, right? So initiatives that just that even teaching students how to recognize microaggressions, how to respond to them. I mean, there's kind of, I feel like, such a litany of amazing educational resources that I'm sure a lot of you in the School of Social Work are familiar with. But consuming information, I think it's tough right now, and that's why it's I think Sam brought up the kind of your crazy uncle, so to speak, before, this person who you're trying to convince to think about things perhaps a little bit differently. But if they're looking at a conspiracy theory that they think has one kernel of truth buried somewhere within it, and they've kind of been brought into the fray of that conspiracy and further down that rabbit hole, it's really difficult to bring people out of. So I think it's unfortunately a really multifaceted challenge.
I'll just add that, sometimes if I go back to my comment about dissociation, one of the things we try to do with dissociation in psychology, what do you do with that, right? We try to begin integrating the different pieces that are disavowed, and so I think about that in the context of education as well. So if we think about K-5 education or K-12 education, and most often what's happened in schools is that families are not really involved with that. It's sort of like there's a curriculum, and a small group of people decide what that curriculum is going to be, and it's not really it's not really a democratic kind of decision around what that curriculum would look like. So often we see things being excluded in our curriculum that don't actually reflect multiple perspectives, and you can think about that from any lens you want, but it's not a very inclusive curriculum. And so in a sense, the curriculum itself is kind of like dissociative in nature. It's sort of like, well, we'll just not remember certain things, or we won't really give you a full history of things. And so I do wonder about the inclusion of communities and families and developing sort of things that people actually believe, and how families will react when we teach about certain things. I know that as a college professor, I've been told that I'm presenting a certain part of, certain type of perspective that some students for the first time are being exposed to it, but if their families might listen to that and think, no, you're totally off base, that's not how the world is. So I think we have a lot to grapple with in terms of what we mean by curriculum and education.
Thank you. So I know that we're coming close to the end of our time. And Emily, I'm hoping perhaps you can share with us some of the work of the Anti-Defamation League, as well as if students are wondering perhaps how they might get involved with countering hate speech and the rise of the alt-right.
Or I like to think that I was a university student not too long ago. I guess it's getting longer and longer since today. Sorry, in my mind, I'm a recent grad. But if you're interested in getting involved in this kind of work from an academic perspective, please feel free to reach out. There's so much research to be done. I mean, I think Daniel's film and everything that Professor Nara has said today, there's a lot really to be uncovered. So I encourage folks that if they are interested in this, to get involved in it. If you're interested in the kind of investigative research work from this angle, I'm always really happy to talk to folks. What our work is at the Center on Extremism is dedicated to shedding a light on those dark places, particularly of the internet where extremists lie, and hopefully to disrupt some of that where we see it. So that's the kind of work that we're engaged in. But I think there's so many ways to look at these issues, whether through film, through social work. Really, I mean, unfortunately, that extremism is touching more and more every kind of facet of society. So I think there's a broad swath of ways to get involved. But I think the panelists here have provided some insight into what that looks like. So yeah, I know I'm happy to facilitate any questions that directly pertain to me, and I'm sure the other panelists are happy.
Thanks a lot, Emily. Daniel, I'd like to give you a chance to have the last word.
Oh man, that's a big responsibility. I'm not sure. I just really appreciate this conversation, coming at it from a social work perspective, from a mental health perspective. I mean, the film is actually kind of empathetic in nature, and the point is not to help you sympathize with them, but to understand how people are drawn to those ideologies, why the phenomenon exists. That was a very controversial decision. I mean, when we went in, we knew that 20% of people would despise it. And if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes, we have a great score, 87%, but all the negative reviews are saying the same thing. This type of movie shouldn't exist. All the people who love it say, thank God this movie exists, because now I know. And it was a very polarizing film. I knew that going in. I'm really proud of the fact that I survived it and made it, and now I can talk about it. And I think the goal is really to, what Emily was saying, is to shine a light, just help people understand what's going on, how pervasive this stuff is all over the US and overseas. But again, what I keep coming back to is also how empty it makes you. And I often get hit with folks who actually haven't seen the film saying, won't this be a recruiting tool? Are you amplifying them? No one has ever come out of this film saying, I want to join that movement. I mean, by the end of the film, it's very clear. And I've screened at evangelical universities, conservative universities, and people all across the spectrum with Muslim nonprofits, and at Duke University, McGill, all different places. And everyone comes out saying, wow, these are people who are pretty broken and who are putting their stock in the wrong place. And I think that is like kind of the emotional conclusion from all of this. And it really takes someone, like a social worker or a filmmaker, to be able to have that kind of distance and to be able to convey that. And it's been really great seeing, most people watch this film and have that takeaway and understand how poisonous this stuff is. But it also leaves us with a lot of questions. What is the solution? And I've offered a few, and all the panelists have as well. And I'm not quite sure what it is. But I think it definitely starts with understanding who these people are and why they're drawn to this ideology.
Thank you. Well, friends, I think we're at the end of our time. I want to just say a big thank you to Emily and Usher for joining us as panelists. A big thank you to Daniel for all of your hard work in creating and producing and directing this film. I think it's, made a strong impact on me and many of my other colleagues. If you haven't had a chance to check out the film, please be sure to go to the Boston College Library Digital Reserves. You can check that out there. And finally, I'd just like to leave you all with a call to action to consider where you are in your social location as you navigate your day-to-day lives, how you can figure out in your own way to combat the fight against hate wherever you are. With that being said, I thank everyone for attending and wish you a good evening.